Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. It's not looking good for the release of Disney's and Lucasfilm's next movie, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. I had released a video back on May 20th talking about the movie's failure to get good feedback and reviews when it premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in France, and Lucasfilm head Kathleen Kennedy and Disney CEO Bob Iger were in attendance for the premiere. This was also when Disney announced the closure of its failed and overpriced Star Wars Galactic Star Cruiser Hotel at Disney World, while Kathleen Kennedy was too preoccupied with the events at Cannes. This fifth Indiana Jones movie that no fans of the franchise actually wanted in the first place will in fact be the first movie to be released by Lucasfilm since that dumpster fire of a movie, Star Wars 9: The Rise of Palpatine, was released back in 2019, and that was 3.5 years ago. And I've heard a variety of rumors recently that Kathleen Kennedy's job as president of Lucasfilm may be on the line if this fifth Indiana Jones movie fails at the box office due to its incredibly steep production budget of $294.7 million. That incredibly high production budget means that Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny also has an incredibly high break-even point, which I am estimating using my traditional method of multiplying the production budget by 2.5 to account for the 50% of gross ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget. That leads to an estimated mid-range break-even point of $736.8 million. But since Disney is heavily marketing the movie, the break-even point may be closer to 3 times the production budget, which would take it up to around $884.1 million. So if you have been wondering why so many have been claiming that the movie will probably need around $900 million just to break even, well, this is the reason why. So what kind of an opening weekend box office would the movie need to potentially reach $884.1 million? That's a good question. As illustrated by this chart, at the global level, if the box office experiences week-to-week drops between 30 to 40% after opening weekend, then the movie will need a global opening weekend box office somewhere in the neighborhood of $265.2 million and $353.6 million to guarantee that it can reach $884.1 million. But what would the domestic box office need to be in order to achieve this much global box office during opening weekend? For that, we need to estimate what the movie's domestic share might be. And since it's been 15 years since the last Indiana Jones movie was released, all we can do is to look at its domestic share and those of the earlier movies that go back to the 1980s. For 1981's Raiders of the Lost Ark, its domestic share was a hefty 61.4%. For 1984's Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, the domestic share improved to 54%. For 1989's Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which arguably should have been the final film for the franchise, its domestic share was even better at 41.6%. And surprisingly, the domestic share for 2008's Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull was 40.3%. Now, while there's been a consistent decline in domestic share over the course of the first 4 movies, that's no guarantee that this movie will do as well. But there also does seem to be a bit of a convergence towards 40%, suggesting that the domestic share may be less likely to go below that. So what I will do is to look at a potential range of domestic shares for the movie that are close to how the franchise has historically performed, and that range will be from 40% to 60%. So for that idealized global opening weekend box office range of $265.2 million to $353.6 million, I generated the following chart. For those who saw my previous video about the new Transformers movie, This chart may look familiar, though this is looking at an idealized situation, not projected data. In this chart, the horizontal x-axis represents the domestic share going from 40% to 60% as you move from left to right. The blue line represents the idealized domestic opening weekend box office based on the low $265.2 million idealized global opening weekend box office and the corresponding domestic share. The red line is similar, but is based on the higher $353.6 million idealized global opening weekend box office. So for the idealized case of a $265.2 million global opening weekend box office, with its 30% weekly box office drops, at a 40% domestic share, the equivalent US opening weekend box office would need to be around $106 million, which would be the best case. But at a domestic share of 60%, the US opening weekend box office would need to be around $159 million. For the idealized case of a $353.6 million global opening weekend box office, with its 40% weekly box office drops, at a 40% domestic share, the equivalent US opening weekend box office would need to be around $141 million. But at a domestic share of 60%, the US opening weekend box office would need to be around $212 million, and that would be the worst case for this idealized range. So now we know that in order for Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny to have a chance to reach the $884.1 million estimated break-even point, the domestic opening weekend box office will need to be somewhere within the neighborhood of $106 million to $212 million, with the caveat being that the lower the opening weekend box office is, the lower the week-to-week drops in box office will correspondingly need to be. If the domestic opening weekend box office is less than $106 million, then the movie's ability to break even will become increasingly unlikely the lower the actual opening weekend box office ends up being. And as of yesterday, Deadline is predicting a $60 million domestic opening weekend box office for the movie, and that's $46 million below the lowest idealized domestic opening weekend box office value that I just shared in order for the global box office to reach $884.1 million. So where would a $60 million domestic opening weekend box office put the final potential global box office earnings for the movie? As illustrated by this next chart, if the weekly drops in domestic box office are around 40 to 30%, that would put the final domestic box office for the movie somewhere in the neighborhood of $150 million to $200 million, which is just sad. Because those final projected domestic box office earnings are within the range of idealized domestic opening weekend box office that the movie needs to earn in order to have a chance of breaking even. So with such low potential final domestic box office numbers, this would mean that the movie will need to earn a tremendous but probably unlikely amount of international box office in order for the movie to have a chance of getting close to earning $884.1 million. Given that the historic domestic share for the Indiana Jones franchise ranges from as high as 60% to as low as 40%, if we look at this next chart, we can plainly see that for a worst-case domestic share of around 60%, the movie would only earn around $250 million to $333 million globally, and that would be around one-third of what the movie actually needs to break even. At the best-case end of the domestic range, which would be 40%, the movie's final global box office would be around $375 million to $500 million, which in the best case would only be slightly more than half of what the movie actually needs to break even. To get close to the estimated $884.1 million break-even point, the movie's domestic share, in the best case of it earning $200 million domestically, would have to be around 22.5%, and that's simply not a realistic number. So if Kathleen Kennedy's Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny only earns $60 million domestically during its opening weekend, it will most definitely flop by a significant amount of money. There are simply no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And what could this mean for her career as president of Lucasfilm? Any CEO that has even half an ounce of common sense would remove her from that position and then pass the reins to someone far more qualified and hopefully has a lot more common sense than that now 70-year-old hag whose only motivations have been to push feminist identity politics, including in this latest Indiana Jones movie. If Bob Iger doesn't do anything, then Disney's shareholders may just have to initiate another possible revolt against him and Disney's board, because there's no way that Disney will be able to resume paying dividends to shareholders if all the company is capable of producing are expensive blockbuster movies that lose hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to see more of our videos in the future and help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.